first time this fella went fishing for salmon in the Shannon, he got a fish of, I think, 39 pounds, which he then sold to a local fishmonger at 2 shillings the pound. His best day was 12 salmon. There was one of 48.5 pounds. There was 3 between 30 and 35 pounds, and the rest were good fish, and the only small fish was one of 12 pounds.
Hello and welcome to the Ireland on the Fly podcast about the people and places of fly fishing in Ireland. And on this week's show we have, after a long hiatus, another book club episode, this time focusing on O'Gorman and the practice of angling from 1845. Who was O'Gorman, many of you may be asking? Well, in many ways he was our Izaak Walton, albeit a lot better. And this week's guest is Patrick Gageby, fly angler, barrister, and who co-wrote the introduction to a reissued version of O'Gorman's book, and who will explain all. But first, Tom, before we hear from Patrick, I know you're a big fan of O'Gorman's.
Yeah, Commander. Yeah, I mentioned there when we were chatting to Patrick, I got the book 25 years ago, the reissued one, and I just fell for it straight away for a lot of reasons, and you'll hear it in the interview, particularly with regards to the flies. But yeah, it just really caught me. And I know when I was chatting to you, when you read it first, funny, it didn't grab you as much first, and then it's only when you're looking back at it, there are some parts of it. So it's like anything. I just really took to it, and I suppose I'm rereading it and going back over it. It's just something that I'm completely fascinated by. Like yourself, like I have a huge love of history, right? And I have a love of angling history as well. And quite a lot of the stuff that he writes about is in my neck of the woods as well. So the whole thing coupled, I was always going to fall for it. Always got to fall for it.
And in fairness, actually, it was only after even doing this episode and revisiting the book, and this is why we are recommending it for people who are listening, who are interested. This is about fly fishing in Ireland, the history, the culture, the practice of fly fishing in Ireland. It was written by an Irishman, as Patrick Gageby points out. It was 1845 when it came out. If you want a real insight into the incredible fishing that was available around the country, it's in 2 volumes. He covers Connemara, he covers Munster, he covers Leinster, trout, salmon. You just get, he talks, and Patrick mentions this, a 48-pound salmon he caught. His best day of salmon fishing was 12 fish to 335 pounds or something. The halcyon days, and if you want, but it was written by an Irishman. You get that insight into Irish life and Irish culture as he travels around the country. And again, that's why we mentioned Walton. People revere Walton as the the complete angler, as the kind of the foundation text for fly fishing. But for Irish fly fishing, I think maybe O'Gorman's book should be the starting point. Do you think, Tom?
Oh, definitely. I really do. I mean, as we say, he's the first Irish angler to write a complete work on angling. And I say it as well, some of the stuff in it, we discussed it there with Patrick, some of his advice is so pertinent today. You go through what he writes about, right, all right, a lot of the technical stuff in the 170 years, whatever it is now, has changed. But, a lot of the other advice is still held true. I mentioned it there. He says with the salmon, do not strike sight away. Let the fish disappear down. Yeah, it's still true today, and sometimes I wish I'd listened to it sometimes today. But as you said, I think let's we'll start the campaign.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, O'Gorman, who needs Walton and Cotton from Irish fly fishing? It might be a bit later, but it was still it's worth remembering where we came from, I think.
It is, yeah. Now, we mentioned it there now, and if you're like me, I suppose a bit like you, like the physical feeling of a book. Yeah, I mean, I'd always go for that. So it's not the cheapest. Even tried to get the classic Fly Fishers Library edition, because that hasn't been reprinted or anything. But you can get it online. So if you want to see it now,
go to openlibrary.org.
Yeah, so you can you can breeze through it and go through it that way. So you don't have to. If you really want to see some of the stuff that's in it, you don't have to take out a second mortgage to get a first edition.
Yeah.
But
it might give you a taste. Get the PDF downloaded, put it onto your Kindle, whatever reading device.
That's it. Yeah. No, I have to say, for old books, something about it. I just like physical feel of reading them. But
If you did enjoy it, or if you have any thoughts on it, do let us know. And actually, if there's any other
Yeah.
books, we are going to be covering a lot more books as well in our book club episodes. I know they're kind of irregular at the moment because, you know, we do get caught up in the whole fly fishing season, and there's a lot of stuff coming up, but it's nice to dip in and out of these episodes just to remind ourselves of the culture and the history.
It is actually, and you've said it there. I hadn't realized, but it was a fair old hiatus to our last one, and so yeah, and they're really interesting to do. And we often say that. I mean, we know our listenership is broad and everything. Some people, it's not everybody's cup of tea, but there's a core guys and girls out there that like the angling literature side of things. So good for all you guys as well.
So for all 10 of you that are, stick with us the rest of it.
Come on, it's got to be 11.
Rising tide lift all boats eventually.
Yeah, that's what they say. Yeah.
But look, let's get back to this week's guest anyway, Patrick Gageby, who first gives us the background to the book and the author himself.
O'Gorman's book was first published, I think, in 1845 or 46. And then there was a second edition, but I don't think there was any additions to it about 10 years later, in fact, in the year that he died. So he's an interesting fellow because he's born about 1765. He died about 90 years later. He was from a relatively prosperous Clare family with a bit of land and I think some merchant connections. He seems to have been a person of some importance in what's called the Back Lane Parliament, in other words, which was part of a group advocating for Catholic rights in 1792 or so, when Wolfe Tone was the secretary to that. I can't quite work out if it's important at all what his religion was. And he leaves a number of clues in the book. He's got a wonderful account towards the end of the book of traveling to Connemara for the first time, I think, and staying in Kilroy's Hotel in Galway, and meeting there a Methodist preacher whom he says he almost converted to the ancient faith. Now, this may say a lot about O'Gorman or nothing of the Methodist minister, but he was also, when he died, he was a member of a local Masonic lodge. So I haven't really figured that out. And he was also very friendly with the Plunketts. And the Plunketts were a big church and law family. They owned a vast estate in Tourmakeady, bits and pieces of which are still there. And they also rented, I think, Delphi Lodge from Lord Sligo, or the Earl of Sligo, or whatever his title is. So I'm just not sure about that sort of stuff. But leaving aside religion and all that sort of stuff, the reason why I think it's a great book is, firstly, he actually was really very interested in the mechanics of fishing. That is to say, he was, he gave very practical instruction on the type of rod one should have. So, for instance, the poor fools on the Blackwater fished with rods that were 25 plus feet, which he thought was ridiculous, when everyone else on the Shannon only used rods of, I think, about 16 to 20 feet. And he gave exact descriptions of what your rod should be made of. There should be hickory, lancewood, and the butt, I think, of crag ash, which I'm presuming is all the stunted ash from the crags of the burn, but I could be wrong. In that connection, I think this is basically the original version of is it the greenheart rod they used to call them in the 19th century? Yeah, is that it? Yeah. And I have only once used a greenheart rod. I'm old, but not that old. And the circumstances were I wanted to learn how to cast a salmon rod. And what else should I do but find J.R. Harris, the author of An Angler's Entomology, who agreed to give me lessons out in the Phoenix Park. On this occasion, there were many odd remarks from people passing by. At the end of it, I stood him a drink, or possibly two, in a local pub by Sarah Bridge, where within 10 minutes he had found that the man sitting next to him knew all about salmon, had fished all his life on the Liffey, mainly with, I think, a stroke haul, a gaff, and possibly a net, and had winkled out some secrets from him. Now, apart from that digression, therefore, why is the book good? Well, firstly, there's a lot of interesting social history in it. And he certainly, by and large, seems to have fished by the leave of the gentry. The Plunketts were major gentry, and also of an amount of the people around Clare, where there was fantastic trout fishing, which I don't think anybody would recognize now. But what are the standouts? Well, I read this book first about 35 years ago, and then Kevin McKenna and myself wrote an introduction to the republication of it by the Fly Fishers Classic Library. And Kevin did all the research, which you'll find in the 2 or 3 pages of the introduction. But what are the standouts? I suppose it's what's gone. I mean, let's face it, the first time this fellow went fishing for salmon in the Shannon, he got a fish of, I think, 39 pounds, which he then sold to a local fishmonger at 2 shillings the pound. His best day was 12 salmon. There was one of 48.5 pounds. There were 3 between 30 and 35 pounds, and the rest were good fish. And the only small fish was one of 12 pounds. I think that makes nearly 300 weight of salmon. And he indicates that the bag was so heavy, they had to actually put the fish in a boat and move down to a salmon weir, filch the basket from the King's Gap, and thus ferry home their fish. So that's my favorite bit, as it were. I think of the 2 volumes, the first volume is much the better. It's got a lot of interesting instruction. It tells you how to make the flies, and you can still make the flies in those particular way, except I think for none of them you have to have both donkey fur and pig fur. I'm sure we could arrange that for anybody that wanted it. It's a really interesting read. And he did have a couple of foibles. In fact, he had an awful lot of foibles.
Yeah.
He didn't believe in multiplier reels.
That comes across fairly strongly.
Yes, indeed.
It really does, yeah.
Yeah, I think he denounces them as being based on vicious principles.
Yes.
Now, I've spoken too long and digressed too long. So,
well, it's very interesting you say that. Funny, you picked up on the salmon one there. But one of the times, and it is very true, Patrick, talking about times past, but one of the times that he's up staying with the Plunketts and he travels between Tourmakeedy and Delphi, for the time he was there, now, he doesn't give the amount of days, but it does give the total of their catch, which is 1,700 trout.
Yes.
And I think it was 35 salmon. The salmon weren't big, only to 10.5 pounds.
Yeah.
I agree with you totally. It kind of wanes off in the second volume. It really does. I think you're right. It gets into the nitty gritty, and some of the best stuff is in the first volume. And I'd forgotten this chapter. I found a chapter only the last couple of days. And it's a very small chapter. I think it tells a lot about him as well. It's when he goes to Currafin and he stays in Sweeney's. And
this is the story where they get atrociously drunk,
hammered
yes, and where it starts out with a very good bottle of port from the owner of the hotel, and then it moves on to half gallons of punch.
Punch.
And then there's a row with a military man, and O'Gorman, of course, I think had a military history, and he was very fond of gentlemen of the law and gentlemen of the army. He considered that the best anglers were drawn from
He
either
does
of
actually.
those.
He said that, yeah.
And unfortunately, what they did was in the sort of duel of honor, which was conducted inside the hotel, they upset a table upon which the wife of the proprietor had set out her best china for the fair, which is to be the following day, I think, in Ennis. And they broke and smashed every single one of those. And I think they were slightly ashamed of that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the military guy said he'd order somebody to go into Ennis and knock on the doors at this hour of the morning to make sure there was enough teapots for the fair.
Indeed.
Yeah. Yeah, but it was half a gallon of punch, and I think they all got a round of it. And there was about 5 of them.
Oh yeah, but there was many half gallons.
Yeah, yeah.
The good life.
And also as well, while we're on the subject of that, he also says when he's in Delphi, did not want porter for breakfast, but it was pushed on them.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. But he was also a man who thought that when one was fishing, one should always have a good dram bottle with one. But
some things never change.
Yeah, well, there's a wonderful story there where he fell into the Blackwater, was swept down. It sounds like quite a bit of the river, but he was still attached to the salmon that had pulled him in.
Yeah.
So he managed to swim towards the bank. The first thing he did was he threw the salmon up, then he threw the rod, then he threw the gaff, and then he climbed out himself. Yeah. That's proper order. Yeah. Yeah. One needed to be tough in those days.
Yeah, you can really sense that because he falls in as well. The bit where he practices stroke hauling for the first time.
Yes. Yes.
On the Shannon, and this is great for guides or gillies. I'll stick it up. His copman, as he called him, Keen, didn't want to do it. Now this was the first, and as it transpired, the only time he ever tried stroke hauling, right? And he gave such a whack on the stroke haul, right, that on hitting the fish, he fell out, right? And he had to be pulled in by Keen. But the thing is, he reckons the Keen shouts out, "It's a kingfish."
Yes.
Yeah, and he reckons it could have been a sturgeon.
Yeah, there is some minor history of big sturgeon in Ireland, but more so actually in Wales. And I think it was either the Towie or the Teffy.
Yeah.
Even into the early 20th century, there was very occasionally a very large fish was found. And of course, they were a king's fish.
Yeah.
So
they had to be handed over to the king straight away or something.
Yes.
Didn't they?
Something like that.
As soon as they were caught.
Mm.
Yeah, no, but actually, from my view, what got me really interested in the book, Patrick, was because I bought an edition of the Classic Fly Fisher's Library when it came out. And I remember the introduction that yourself and Kevin did. I was fascinated by the whole thing. One thing really got me, and it's a little story I always tell, but in that edition, there was a plate at the front of 6 flies that were tied for O'Gorman in 1791 by Corny Gorman.
Yes.
Do you know where were they kept, or where did they come about from, or
I think they must have been from Kevin. I think I probably saw them in the flesh, but Kevin was very interested in angling and knew a lot more about the literature than I did, and I was only just thinking the same thing, looking at it and saying, how do fishing flies survive for 230 years or so? Or 200 years was that? Yeah.
I thought,
And they're very beautiful, aren't they?
They're beautiful. But here's my story about this. I don't know if I've told you that. I had a fly on Loch Mass that was really killing. I invented it myself. I did really well with it. I remember one day in the heat in the World Cup, I did really well. I had 4 fish and 3 of them were in that fly. And I was calling it, okay, I was calling it my doc special. Of course I was.
Yep.
And I was gonna, this is grand. And basically, I had done this to copy a Welshman's button, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and basically what it was done, it was kind of like claret and mallard, but it was more of a cinnamon body. But I put a yellow butt on it, and I
Mm-hmm.
had a nice partridge hack on it. It was, I hadn't seen anything else like it, and it really worked for me. When I got a copy of that book and I opened the plate,
Yeah.
I looked, and there in the bottom left-hand corner was my fly.
That's it.
Exactly the
Genius.
same.
You're both geniuses.
Nothing original
Well, like,
these days.
yeah, and that's really what happened to him. Like Doc Special went out the window, and it's the Dromore fly that he talks about.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
although as much I can see, you see, if you look into it and he talks about the Dromore fly, kind of changes it a bit. It's not always the exact same. He changes it for salmon to trout.
Yeah.
And the one he's saying it's a green butt, but if you look at the picture, none of the flies have a green butt and they have more of a yellow butt. Now, maybe it's faded, and maybe I could steal the whole title that I did invent this fly, but I think not.
Do we know how was the book received when it was published?
Do you know, I don't actually know. I came across very few references to it, and I think only saw it once in a bookshop at a time before there were any reprints. And it's not referenced much in Irish books that followed it. But I suppose one of the reasons why it is an interesting book is that it's a book by an Irishman, as opposed to being one of the wandering Englishmen who wrote so many tour books in Ireland and never failed to comment on the ignorance of everybody around them, the dirt, and the need for improvement. You know, none of which, it appears, fell on fertile ground. So I think it's because he's a sort of son of the soil, as it were. Although I don't think he ever dug it himself. I think he was doing quite nicely. And if you look at the picture of him at the front of the book, he's wearing a gentleman's attire. But I don't find it referenced really. Maybe there's 20 books after it, bringing us right up to the middle of the 20th century, and I really don't see any great cognizance of it.
Yeah, can we put our finger on that, or?
Yeah, it's hard to know. See, so many of the books are about excursions, simply excursions into the country. And some places get very popular. But also there was a large amount of fishing that simply wasn't accessible unless you had the walk-on from somebody with a bit of money. So, for instance, if you move sort of forward, I don't know, do you know a book called Irish Sport of Yesterday by Major A.W. Long?
No.
I don't know that one, no.
Yeah, it's published about 1910 with some of his own photographs. And he rented a house on the Kilry, just opposite Bundoraha, the piers Bundoraha, and fished the Erith and the rivers around there, and I think possibly up the Owen Duff angling literature, except one book, which is Wild Sports of the West.
Yeah.
And Wild Sports of the West is written by Hamilton Maxwell, who's a drinker, a carouser, likewise loves the army, and he's also in holy orders, but he spends most of his time hunting, shooting, and fishing. And that book goes, it's first published in 1832, and that book goes through a number of editions and was still being published right into the 1920s and 30s. So you can buy like a cheap edition from Talbot Press and things like that.
And you can even, there was a translation into Irish in the early 1900s. Yeah.
Wow.
It was, I came across a copy of it once. But it's very interesting. Yeah, you look at that. But yes, and I got a chance to read a lot of the older books now. And to be honest, I mean, his attention to detail on tackle is very good. Like, it is a really good how to do book in the chapters that he's not talking about fishing or drinking, should we say? I mean, he pays attention to detail how to make up your cast with a three-stop um, connection.
Silk.
From your silk line to your casting line, which is your flies.
Gut.
He calls to your gut. It's interesting. He calls what your flies is on, like your tip of material. He calls it your casting.
Yeah.
The flies are on, and then the silk line, and all of that. And he's very good about all of that. So, like, you see, like, Wild Sports of the West pays very little of that. It's more about stories.
Yes.
There isn't much in that. And then the other ones, I've been lucky enough to read a couple of the other ones by the English authors, and I think it really comes across with O'Gorman. Like, O'Gorman names the guides, names the gillies, names them by name. He's you can tell that there's something there. Now, he does use the word peasants in one of the thing, all right, when he's giving out about something. So yeah, and he's definitely wealthy. I met a guy, fellow from Ennis once, who had researched this and had researched the fact that O'Gorman is probably related to Boris Johnson, but that's further down the line. Apparently, the O'Gorman's grandfather would have been Boris Johnson's 7th great-grandparent, something like that. But I was chatting to Declan about it. He was great, but what he said to me, like, and he definitely was wealthy. What he was left was £1,600 a year, and that was when his father died in that was in the late 1700s. That was a huge sum of money, so he was wealthy.
He had a decent stipend. And actually, I wanted to ask you, because when I read it, I have to say I really enjoyed the voice to it. He's kind of not flippant, but he enjoys life. And it did irk me though, and I've said this to Tom before. It was you pick up that condescension to the peasantry.
Yes.
Which
you would be like that if you were a gentleman.
Yeah, but like if I was reading it, and if it was written by an English major or a visiting English, like as you mentioned, Patrick, it just irks me that I was reading this from an Irishman. But you're like, I can understand. Yes, you're a gentleman, so you're very much of not necessarily Anglo-Irish stock, but your leanings might be to a certain way. And this is where I was very interested in when you look at his career. And we might just delve a little bit into this. He joined the yeomanry, isn't that right, in the late 1790s? So what I'm asking, and then he opposed, wasn't it, O'Connell's bid, was it, during one of the elections in the 1800s, was that right?
O'Connell ran in Clare,
Yeah, and he opposed O'Connell's candidacy there. Whereas his brother was very involved for the United Irishmen.
Is that Purcell O'Gorman?
Nicholas Purcell.
So
Purcell O'Gorman.
I suppose what I was trying to read too much in it was that, in the sense of when he was talking about the peasantry and maybe kind of looking down his nose at them. I was wondering, was there some kind of change that he went one way, his brother went the other, and that this is reflected through the political time, and then also then in the book.
Yeah, but don't forget that Nicholas Purcell O'Gorman, he was an MP, wasn't he? I mean, he would have been elected by approximately 200 or 300 people, and none of them were, no peasant had a vote.
Yeah.
And can I just point out, there is an element of rivalry between Clare and Tipperary in this, I think, because, there's the famous Irish saying that, of course, in the old days in Ireland, before the English came, I'm assuming is implicit in that, a virgin with a bag full of gold could walk from Mallinhead to the tip of Kerry without fear of molestation of her fortune or her virtue. And he added, except in Tipperary. Yes.
I am not going to, as I live in Tipperary, I am a dub living in Tipperary. I am not going to add any further to that. I never heard that.
I suppose what you're saying there, Darrell, but then how many contemporary reports do we have of, let's say, Irish people from that era that would be very well off. Was it a fact that, that still, once they were wealthy like that, it was probably a class
Yeah.
society.
No,
Class
100%.
society.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, look. I totally agree with you. He came from a certain class. He would have had a certain view on the peasantry to that, and especially, I suppose, if you're involved in fly fishing for salmon, it puts you in a certain elite anyway. No matter, and then
Yes.
coupled to that with the money, and I suppose it is interesting that he didn't become as involved in politics as his brother did. He was more into the country lifestyle.
Yeah, and it's funny though that you said that as well, Derek, because I suppose, and it's probably because I read what you were saying as well there, Patrick, of the other books that were by the traveling, visiting angler, and wanted the improvement to be brought upon Ireland, and talked about the dirt and the squalor. See, I don't see that with in O'Gorman's book, and I see him talking, naming the gillies, naming them, talking at them, and naming Corny O'Gorman, who lived. I don't think Corny Gorman lived very well either.
No. And he died in the cholera epidemic in 1832 in Ennis.
Yeah. So,
and he must have been quite a good age.
Yeah, he must have been, because he was tying the flies in 1791. So that's well at 40 years afterwards. So in comparison, let's say the visiting anglers, I really don't see it. He speaks quite well of guy of the gillies.
Yeah. I'd really like to see a book written by Corny Gorman, if you ever.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. Yeah.
And of course, to remember that there would have been so much Irish, particularly in Clare.
And that's I'm digressing here as well. I wonder, did he have Irish? Because there is one thing in the book where he's talking about this is when he's giving advice, which is, once again, he says never wear gloves. Right? He says gloves should not be worn when fishing, which I agree with totally. Like, a lot of his advice is still very pertinent today. And he says, don't strike a salmon too quick, which is very good. Give him time to go down. He says, don't wear gloves. And what is it? A muffled cat catches no mice, right?
And he then says it's slightly ruder in the Irish.
Yeah, he does. Yeah. So I was just wondering then, would he spoken Irish? But as you say, Irish was quite rampant, not rampant, well spoken throughout Clare then.
Yeah, I don't get the idea that, if you had to have intercourse with people for business, even if it was just your tenantry, you wouldn't know what they were saying.
Yeah.
To the extent that I think the ability of people who were above the rank of the peasantry to understand what was being said was probably quite normal.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting thing that really there isn't a word of Irish in it, and nobody talks about the language, and yet
no, it doesn't. That's the only mention of it in the whole book that I came across. Yeah, and I thought it was good. I'm going to try and find out what the Irish Seanachal for that is.
Yes.
I don't know if we know this as well. Do we know who the intended audience was? It an English audience?
I suspect not. He does say, and he says variously, that the book arose out of letters that he wrote either to, I think, Jonathan Henn or to David Plunkett, or both. And he says both of those things, that he wrote correspondence to them, then retrieved some of the correspondence from them and used that. I think he did that to basically write what is in the first volume. I do not see it being directed at across the water. In fact, there just doesn't seem to be that sort of trait in it. The only time that the English really get a very good mention in it is in the second volume. He has fits of crossness about the new Fisheries Act, and
Oh yeah,
yes, and the question of weirs being stopped up in the King's Gap, and he keeps coming back page after page to the wonderful act of King Charles the Second, whatever it was, in 1662 or something like that. And it's a very tiresome part of the book. I'd
it
have to
is. Yeah,
say I switched
skip.
off.
It's
Yeah,
very hard. It's like it's a chore to go through it.
yeah.
Yeah,
But
but
he
he's
was
very much.
published. He was published by a very I think it was James Curry and Company who published it, and he was a very big publisher of um, of um, history, geography, folklore, and stuff like that. So, I mean, he had a publisher who was a very good commercial business person. But I only saw the book once in an Irish bookshop or catalogue.
Was it kind of forgotten, like you said, because even, you know, in the kind of the latter books that were, you know, dealing with Irish fly fishing or Irish fishing, it wasn't kind of really mentioned. Was the R. Walton? But in many
Oh God, I hope he was better than that.
but was forgotten about in the same, you know, the way Walton was revered so much, generation after generation, century after century. Whereas in kind of typical Irish fashion, one of our own, we kind of just, you know, chose to ignore him. Like, yeah.
Well, I mean, I do think he had some very laudable ideas. For instance, he said, if you want to make a fly wallet, don't go into Mr. Ettingsel's shop on Merchant's Quay and buy one there. Go to your library, pull out many novels, and he goes through about 12 authors. And I think in respect of all of them, I ditched them, particularly Scott, you know, like the Waverley novels, 35 volumes of dribble. And he says, what you do is you take out a nice volume, a really nice volume with a nice bit of leather and stuff like that. You tear out all the text. You then stitch up the sides, and that's what you keep your flies in.
Yeah.
It also suggests he has rather large pockets as well.
Yeah.
It's a very good suggestion, actually, in fairness.
Yeah, well, I used to have when I had the disease of fishing, or an interest in it, I had a couple of mid-19th century fly wallets, which were just like very thick wallets with sort of felt and fur in them. You know, there was no metal boxes.
Mm. No, that's what they used. Leather was mainly the one. Yeah, I remember reading that. Good idea.
Yeah. And he also, by the way, he was quite good. He mentions, I think, you know, places that have just disappeared. I mean, can you imagine what the Shannon was like at Castle Connell?
Yeah.
When the river was flowing through it? It was mighty. And he mentions, you know, Enrights of Castle Connell. I think I have a reel made by Enrights.
Yeah.
And he was very particular about reels.
Yeah.
The one thing you couldn't have in a reel was a little ivory.
On the spindle
ivory
handle.
on the handle.
Spin ivory coated on the handle because it would only jam. Basically, that was his pretext. Was that it was kind of alongside his multiplier thing. He was just in fear of anything jamming on a reel. That was obviously his thing. Yeah, or he said ivory or even wood on it. He just wanted a straight spindle.
Yes.
Didn't want anything revolving on it. Yeah, no.
A pin.
But it's very interesting when you talk about what those Shannon waters must have been like, and he talks about the two ways of fishing them, and dragging, where the cot would go up onto poles that were all over the place, and they would put the cot onto a pole, and they would have minimum of 2 rods, or if not 3 rods, and they would troll over the lies, drag over the lies, as they called it. Yeah, and it was basically like harling, I suppose.
Yeah. And of course, Castle Connell, you know, is still a lovely village and has, you know, a beautiful array of Georgian houses, big ones on the banks and some more modest ones elsewhere. And that was all built on the beauty of the landscape and the incredible fishing.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to read the Fishing Gazette for the 19th and early 20th century. and just the size of the fish. And gentlemen didn't really fish once the peel came in, which is, I think they basically considered anything under 10 pounds to be unworthy of paying attention to them,
Yeah.
I mean, when you consider the wonderful catch of 200 or 300 hundredweight,
Yeah.
man has caught what was his best fish? Was it 48?
48.
48, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, 48 pounds. Yeah, lovely idea. I mean, I've often walked at Castle Connell. I've fished it once or twice, and there's more water in the Liffey,
Yeah. Yeah. It's just, I'd say it must have been something else when it was on its go. Must have been. He talks too of back then, because we're talking about places that were like the Clear Lakes.
Yeah,
were apparently fantastic. And he talks of big trout in Loch Mask as well. And the biggest he knows of was over 20 pounds. But the funny thing that I liked it there, he mentions a boatman by the name of Jennings, who told me of was a trout of 60 pounds. He saw it weighed himself, he said.
yes.
I really think when he's writing that, he's sort of saying,
Yes.
well, I'm just, don't shoot the messenger.
Yes, indeed, yes. But I mean, the size of the trout that he mentions in the Clare Lakes,
Oh, yeah.
it's very hard to credit that there could be such an enormous amount of trout and trout of such size.
Yeah.
And he does indicate that most places were ruined by the stopping of the streams and netting by the
traps and things all over the place. Yeah, and that comes a lot all through it. He's dead set against these all over the place, but particularly in the Clear Lakes. One of the catches, all right, he says it's one of his catches on Tedan, I think, was 13 trout for 65 pounds.
Yeah.
And I think that's the other thing why we would recommend this for people to pick it up, is that it gives us that insight into what it was like, isn't it? You mentioned the 48 pounds there, Patrick, the trout, it's the detail. Like, I'll just give people, like, I love the detail he goes into when he's writing about, the people or the landscape. You do really get insights into it. I'll just read a couple of lines here. This is when he's talking about going to Delphi. With much difficulty procured a skiff to take me. I did not know where or how far. Became restless, saucy and fretful. Told the men what was true, that they were bad rowers. One of them asked if I'd ever been on the water before. He was much surprised when I told him I had seen more salt water in one day than he had during his life. Seemed to have gained some respect in consequence of this observation. After about 3 miles rowing, went across and asked where Delphi was, about 2 miles off. Desired the men take my luggage and leave their oars in the boat. They replied if they did, they would have no account of them on the return. Heartily tired, having come by various conveyances over 50 miles from Galway. Sundown and late, expected dinner to be over, but in this I was most agreeably deceived. It's just, you really get an insight into Irish life and culture, aside from the fishing even.
And the wonderful thing is that, I started fishing the Delphi about 1981 or something. And this was before any of the larger houses and places had been built. And it was still the most beautiful place in the spring. And the river is just spectacular. He talks about the clarity of the water, which is true. Mm-hmm. And of course, that river, particularly at the last 3 or 4 pools, has a very sizable population of pearl mussels, pearl mussels. The Irish, the very large Irish mussel, and it's actually very hard to fish one of those pools without actually catching one of the mussels, because they're filter feeding, they have their gills out and whatnot. And the last time I was there, I was with my brother-in-law. And I said, you're going to catch on this pool, you're going to catch a mussel. And he did. And we carefully put it back, given that it was probably about 100 years old.
Yeah.
And there's not many rivers that have those creatures.
It's one of the few. It's one of the few. Yeah. But it's true. And it is very true. And he notes of it there, but it's still the same now. of, you know, how clear the water is running in that
Mm.
in that stretch of river, which is so unusual for like most, let's say, Connemara rivers that normally
Yeah,
have that tea stain, but it
yeah,
really doesn't, you know.
yeah, yeah. Beautiful sand underneath. I
Mm.
think it's all a washout from the glacial moraine or something like that. And when you look at the names there, so there's Finloch at the bottom, which is the clear, the bright lake. Then there's Duloch, which is the black lake. And is it Glencullen, the one at the top?
Glencullen is the top lake.
Cullen is what a hazel, not hazel. It's hazel or holly. I can't remember
Yeah.
which. Yeah,
Holly, the
holly.
Holly,
Yeah,
the Valley of the Holly.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You know, Delphi is also a very interesting place because uh, I had a friend who had the fishing diary of Charles Kendall Bush, who was Lord Chief Justice in about the 1840s and 50s. And he fished in Delphi a lot and had amazing descriptions of his fishing, particularly on the river there. And I remember he had noted at some stage a death, a drowning in the river. And I can't remember what the circumstances were. And there is a pool on that river called the Deadman's Pool, Powland Dinamarv,
Yeah. That's probably, yeah.
which is an extraordinary pool. It's not fished very much. I don't think it's one of the best fishing pools. And the first time I ever really fished there, I threw an enormous fly into the deepest part of the pool and was retrieving it using I had a split cane rod. And all I could see was something large and white. And as I looked more closely in, what I realized it was the open mouth of a very large salmon coming up from my fly. So I did like anybody did, and I immediately jerked the fly out. Surprise. But I've never walked past that pool without thinking that there was a story from about 150, 170, 180 years ago that the Lord Chief Justice, when he was fishing, this is the Lord Chief Justice who lived, I think, in Mespil House on the Grand Canal in Dublin, and for diversion, used to walk up to Hazelhatch, up almost in Kildare, fishing the Grand Canal.
Right.
Yeah.
And what actually do you know what he was fishing for?
He was a gentleman, so it was definitely trout.
Right. God, wow. Oh, God, there were some times. So,
Yeah.
just Patrick, just there before we go, like, I mean, that the whole O'Gorman book really has had a huge thing on me looking back at the history thing. What, when you look back at the book, what do you think is the most striking part from it for you?
Oh, I think it's what's lost. I
Mm.
think Shannon, the loss of the Shannon. I'm not saying it shouldn't have happened, but you know what an extraordinary place. The largest, the longest river in the British Isles, with the most enormous fish and really, really wild fishing, which you just can't replicate anywhere. I think it's very romantic, and in a very, very different way, it's what I also found very attractive about Kingsmill and the Slaney. You know, that
Yeah.
sense of, you know, great days.
Paradise Lost.
Yeah.
Exactly. Or as Kingsmill said, apropos of Delphi, said, another Eden vanished.
Yes, yes, exactly. That's exactly. And if anybody's got a spare 600 quid sterling, you can get the first edition. I just see it there on anglebooks.com.
Of course, you can get it online, but it's as you have to read it on the laptop.
Yeah, the PDF you can download it on
get a PDF.
openlibrary.org, and if you put in the search for that there. Actually, I just wanted to quote from on Cockabondu Books, anglebooks.com, Arthur Greenwood from Salmon, Trout and Sea Trout, July 1993. I think this was when your edition, Patrick, was it? That came out.
Yep.
He says, this is Arthur Greenwood, one of the great rarities of Irish angling books, one of the most entertaining works in the entire literature of angling. Despite the technological chasm between O'Gorman's era and our own, there is much that has not changed. All good angling books should instruct and amuse. As long as rivers run, O'Gorman will give entertainment and enlightenment to those who are privileged to read his book and can appreciate therein a man who loved life and angling and can share that with us from bygone halcyon days. It sums it up well.
Yeah, but I know we went on to there. It's interesting because you touched on, it hasn't come up as much, or there wasn't too many reprints, or it hasn't featured large, and so people going back and are mentioned by other anglers. But God, when I read it the first time, I was bowled over by it. So I don't know, maybe as you said, Dara, it's our forgotten Walton, and as you said, Patrick, a lot better than that.
Yes, well, it is because, as you'll remember, O'Gorman suggested that one might use a book of Byron's. And of course, Byron had nominated Izaak Walton as that quaint old cruel coxcomb, and also apparently established the saying that a rod with a fool in one end and a worm on the other.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we should start the campaign to bring back O'Gorman.
Yes.
It's a brilliant read for insights into, like we said there, the kind of paradise lost of what fishing in Ireland was like in the 1800s. So well worth a recommendation and a read. So I hope everybody listening got a great insight. And Patrick, thanks again for your insights into it. And we'll hopefully speak to you again in the future.
And tight lines.
Our thanks to Patrick Gageby for joining us on the show. Don't forget to rate, review and follow the Ireland on the Fly podcast on Apple, Spotify or wherever you get your podcast from.
Plus you can keep up to date on IrelandOnTheFly.com as well as on Instagram, and myself and Tom will be back with another episode about the people and places of fly fishing in Ireland.